anybody wants to raise some issues about what we've done, Jessica.
I was just wondering, because I think that in the philosophical tradition, when we speak of value, you usually have this conception of something that is absolute or that has an independent existence grounded in reality. And I'm wondering whether we can understand Marx's definition of value as socially necessary labor time as itself something that is socially conditioned, and is there any way that is totally outside, might there be a social configuration that we can imagine in which value is actually itself its representation, when those two things are reconciled, or is value kind of always inevitably a chimera? And I'm wondering whether we can understand Marx's definition of value as socially necessary labor time as itself something that is socially conditioned, and is there any way that is totally outside, might there be a social configuration that we can imagine in which value is actually itself its representation, when those two things are reconciled, or is value kind of always inevitably a chimera?
No, I think you've got to understand Marx's concept of value is something which is internalized in the processes of a capitalist mode of production. And what he will say to you is, you may have alternative values, and that's fine. And you can dream about them and want them and all this kind of stuff. But they don't mean very much unless you can transform the real value system which is governing our daily lives, which is this one. So Marx is not against necessarily thinking about alternative values. And in fact, I think one of the big issues which we face right now is precisely about what alternative values we would like to see operating in the global marketplace. Values of fairness, or values of, and this is particularly coming up in the environmental issue, for example. People want to talk about environmental values which should be in part of this, and I think the answer, again, as I've suggested, is Marx would say that's fine. Well, he might not say that's fine. He has a particular kind of aim of where he wants to go with it, but I think theoretically he would say that's fine. But in order to make your notion of value work, you have to confront the one which is actually dominating us in terms of what's going on in the supermarket, how we're living our daily lives, and all the rest of it. And we're talking about a value theory which is implicated inside of a capitalist mode of production. Now, there's been a categorical mistake in many instances, precisely because value is located in relationship to labor and labor processes, that there's been a lot of thinking in socialist societies of taking Marx's labor theory of value also almost as a normative device to think about how socialism should work. But this is not what Marx is saying. He's saying value is inherent within a capitalist mode of production, and we have to come to terms with what that value is. Now, there are alternative value theories, and you can philosophize about them and think about them and worry about them socially, politically, all the rest of it. But his point is, as I've suggested, you've always got to come back to confront this one, because this is very basic to how capitalist mode of production works. And if you want to instantiate a different set of values, then you've got to overthrow a capitalist mode of production. And that's his revolutionary intent. Sorry, there was a question here.
Yeah, I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we should think about objectification, because I know the preconceived notion I bring to it is much more static in terms of as labor is objectified, it moves away from the laborer and there's this separation. How can I think about that in terms of more process-oriented?
Well, again, the thing is not is not a. For instance, just to give you an example, let's suppose the labor produces a house. Okay, the laborers have produced the house, move away from it, but maybe other laborers move into it. And then there's the issue of, is that house then fixed forever in terms of its value? Well, given the way he set it up, the answer is no. Because let's suppose there are revolutions in technology which suddenly make housing production much easier. Then you can go away from, I don't know, shanty towns to sort of housing of a different kind, and therefore there's a dynamic involved in this. And therefore, you know, this gets back to the fact that something like a house has a use value, and the use value remains a long time, and you can still trade its exchange value, so it has a residual exchange value. So that you can, so again, there's a dynamic here. So it's not, so the thing and the qualities of the thing are not fixed. In fact, again, there's a lot of dynamism in it, but again, Marx by and large is not going to be concerned about that in Capital. He's going to sort of say, okay, I'm going to assume it's fixed for the moment, but nevertheless, what he's saying here is, watch out, it's always in motion, it's never fixed, it's always changing, it's a dynamic concept, not a static one, and the objectification is there, but again, the meaning of the objectification itself changes over time and according to place. So, you know, there are all those elements within it. Yeah.
Does the particular vision of the capitalist world that Marx deals with diverge? I mean, obviously diverges somewhat from ours in modern day, but specifically with the way laws and, you know, create a proprietary, you know, like only certain companies can make one thing, and then, you know, corporations sort of dominate the scene. It's not a free market, protectionist laws, changing trades. Does that affect the values being purely about the socially necessary labor time?
Well, that's one of the questions which you have to ask about what is socially necessary labor time. How is it determined? To what degree is there monopoly power in the market which is determining it? To what degree is there imperialist politics which is determining it? To what degree is there colonial enslavement which is determining it? In other words, those are open questions. And Marx is very much open to discussing those sorts of questions in principle, but again, what we're going to look at is Marx's conception of a pure capitalist mode of production, which in many ways, as we will see, is guided by the vision of classical political economy. In other words, classical political economy assumed there were going to be perfectly functioning markets and the state power was going to be out of the way and there's going to be no monopoly. So Marx tends to say, okay, let's assume that the classical political economists are correct and that's how the world is. And we will see examples where that presumption gets him into difficulties. But actually there's nothing in this conception that says you can't consider all those things, because for me anyway, the category socially necessary is something which is perpetually open. It's constantly changing. What is socially necessary now? as opposed to what was socially necessary in 1850. It's very different. And so, you know, I would want you to think about this as having a flexible reading of this, but realize that Marx is using it in a very specific way, in a very specific situation, for very specific purposes. Yeah.
Does socially necessary imply the amount of labor required for a laborer to reproduce him or herself?
Socially necessary can include that kind of question. As many socialist feminists pointed out in the debates of the 1960s, 1970s, you know, the whole kind of question of socially necessary has to take into account certain basic costs of reproduction that are borne inside of the household and which may be disproportionately borne by women, even though actually, if you look at the whole history of the Industrial Revolution, it was women's labor in the factory that was fundamental, as it is today. I mean, most of the global proletariat right now is women. So the kind of social reproduction aspect of it and how to integrate that into socially necessary has been a contentious issue amongst Marxists. Okay? And what you have to remember, by the way, is that Marx was a little skeptical of this term Marxist. He once said, "I am not a Marxist." And what he meant by that was there were a lot of things that were being said in his name that were not exactly what he had to say. So again, that's one of the reasons I want you to sort of think about this in Marx's own terms, and because you know, it's very important to realize how he expands this notion of social necessity. We will see. How you might want to expand it is again something that's open to discussion and debate. How we should expand it in terms of a socialist project or a socio-ecological project or a social feminist project or whatever, how we should expand it, again, is something very much up to us. And I don't think Marx would want to be read as somehow or other providing a gospel within which you can find yourself. It's not about a confining mode of argument, it's a matter of liberating you to think about all kinds of possibilities, all kinds of alternatives, all kinds of ways to go. Just one more.
Could you just clarify very specifically the difference between use value and exchange value?
Use value is a shirt and a shoe, whatever you use. The exchange value is shirts and shoes in the market and what the price is on them. Put very simply. And it's I don't like to use the word price at this point because we haven't talked really much about money, but when you get further down the line, you'll see it's really about prices realized in the market, and the exchange value is the price of a commodity. Okay, we should leave it there. So thanks very much. And we don't meet next week, right? Because it's, what is it?
Labor Day.
Oh, Labor Day. What a good idea. So next time, I want you to read the rest of Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. So we want to get to the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is pretty short. The rest of this chapter is very curious for a variety of reasons. I've mentioned Marx's literary style. His literary style changes from crisp analytic, like you've seen here, and that goes on for the next one, to what I can only call his kind of accountancy style, which is deadly boring, where this is worth 2 shillings and that's worth 3 shillings and that's worth 2.5 pence, and if we add this to that, then that goes to this. Deadly boring. So the third section is rather long and rather boring of that style, and he could have done it much quicker, in my view. but it has some very important insights in it. But you're going to find yourself struggling. The last section of chapter 1 is the fetishism of commodities, where it's about werewolves and Robinson Crusoe and an incredible kind of literary style. So you suddenly find in this chapter you're going to have a big sample of Marx's different writing styles, and they're all together. Now, if you wrote a PhD that way, people would say, for God's sake, smooth this out. You can't do that. Which style are you going to write in? But he writes in different styles, and he enjoys it. And it's fun, actually, because you start to say, how on earth does this relate to that? And what does this really mean? So anyway, chapter 1's like that. Chapter 2 is relatively short, and again, fairly analytic. Key concepts are laid out a bit like here, so it's a step further along the conceptual apparatus. Okay? So chapters 1 and 2 for next time.